South Korea faces an existential threat at its northern border. Since the Korean War ended with the signing of the 1953 armistice, the threat of a potential invasion from the north casts a great shadow over the ROK. South Korean planners need to plan for every contingency, including the worst one imaginable, which comes in the form of a nuclear war with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Aggressive posturing with nuclear weaponry from the north on the one hand, and uncertainty regarding the scope of future US military support on the other, suddenly made the debate over nuclear weapons relevant again, at least to a significant number of ROK citizens. The decision of whether or not South Korea will arm itself with nuclear weapons can give rise to multiple different outcomes. It will either solidify the current status quo, or herald the age of a nuclear arms race on the Korean peninsula, to name but a few. The debate over whether or not a country should start developing a nuclear arsenal does not happen in a vacuum. There are reasons involved. The first one is obvious and stands just across its northern border. North Korea is investing heavily in its nuclear weapons program and is no stranger to using it as a vehicle to send threats to its neighbor. Trying to build up a conventional force to deter aggression from your neighbor is one thing, but if your neighbor has the capacity to order a preemptive nuclear strike on your country is quite another. With North Korean artillery and nuclear weaponry permanently fixed on the south of the peninsula, ROK planners have to find a way in which they can counter every North Korean piece on the playing board. A knight, bishop, and a couple of pawns might be able to answer the advance of a queen, but if your enemy throws a stick of dynamite on the board, you better have more than an ace up your sleeve. Threats of aggression from the north are not the only thing that influences ROK policymakers. Enter former US President Donald Trump. Given the actions of his administration from his first term, when he halted large-scale military exercises with South Korea while negotiating with Kim Jong-un, and his comments that the South should substantially increase financial support for US forces stationed on the peninsula, made ROK policymakers question the certainty of future US commitments to their ally. With the US presidential election coming ever closer, ROK officials ponder the lengths at which a potential Trump administration would go to defend their ally, considering that US cities are within the range of North Korean intercontinental ballistic missiles. If there comes a time where an isolationist administration takes over the US presidency, the ROK could potentially be left stranded in the shadow of the North's nuclear arsenal. A considerable part of the ROK citizenry is open to exploring other alternatives regarding their collective security. Former President Trump is not the only unknown variable in this equation. US commitment to the defense of the ROK as a whole is suspect. Would the US really retaliate against a North Korean nuclear strike on the South? Considering that North Korea has access to intercontinental ballistic missiles that could potentially reach cities in the continental US, such as the Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-15, South Korean planners are rightly nervous regarding the extent and potential use of the US nuclear umbrella. South Korea could maybe count on the US while the geopolitical stage is relatively quiet. But if US interests suddenly come under threat in Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East simultaneously, American resolve regarding Korea might start to waver. To understand contemporary developments regarding a potential South Korean nuclear weapons program, we have to look back to history. Already interested in nuclear technology in the 1950s, the ROK became a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1957. The Atomic Energy Law was passed in 1958, and in 1959 the Office of Atomic Energy was established by the government. In 1962, a small research unit was the first nuclear reactor to achieve criticality. 10 years later, the ROK started construction of its first nuclear power plant, Quarry 1. The ROK's first flirtations with nuclear weapons technology began in the early 1970s. It It came at a time when Richard Nixon pulled out 20,000 of the 63,000 American troops stationed in the ROK because of the looming defeat in Vietnam. The US wanted her allies in Asia to take more responsibility for their security and defense, a stance which is reminiscent of some proposals made by former President Trump. At that time, North Korea had a stronger conventional force than the ROK, but it did not have access to nuclear weapons. The ROK saw this as an opportunity to gain an advantage over its adversary, which prompted the President Park Chung-hee to launch a secret project to research nuclear weapons. This project has been uncovered by the US, which has then managed to convince the ROK to shut down said project. Seoul promptly signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, in 1975. If historical precedent is anything to go by, then we can conclude that South Korea will not shy away from obtaining a nuclear arsenal if it finds itself in a geopolitical environment that is conducive to such an end. South Korean public interest into the nuclear option is substantial. A poll conducted earlier this year showed that around 73% of respondents believed South Korea should develop its own nuclear weapons. Perhaps the most vocal supporters of nuclear weapons in the ROK are the members of the so-called war generation, the men and women who experienced a conventional war on the Korean peninsula firsthand. A significant number of them believe that the only reliable safeguard against the horrific violence of a conventional war is to be found in nuclear weaponry. This older cohort of Koreans also represents the most unwavering supporters of nuclear weaponry. The younger generation's support of nuclear weapons technology is contingent on various external factors, such as cost of acquisition and the evolving security environment. However, you do not need to have experienced the Korean War firsthand to understand the potential value nuclear weaponry could have as a force of deterrent. The question of having good reasons to want a nuclear bomb is one thing. The question of possessing the technical capacity to build one is quite another. South Korea is positioned quite well in this regard. It is one of the biggest players in the world regarding nuclear technology and industry. South Korea currently operates 26 nuclear reactors, which provide about 1/3 of its electricity. The country is also exporting its nuclear technology. It is currently building UAE's first nuclear power plant and has recently won a bid to build a reactor for the Czech Republic. The technological know-how is therefore covered. Problems arise regarding raw materials, as South Korea's nuclear industry does not reprocess spent fuel and therefore has no access to highly enriched uranium or plutonium. This limitation need not represent an issue for South Korea, as rapid uranium enrichment would certainly raise a lot of eyebrows and invite possible international sanctions and isolation. The ROK could just refine the process and technology needed for enrichment without doing the enrichment itself, but keeping the option on the table. This way, it cannot be accused of proliferation, but still has the capacity to start building nuclear weapons on a relatively short notice. The potential benefits of a nuclear weapon for South Korea are significant. For instance, if South Korea successfully acquires nuclear weapons, it could use them as a bargaining chip to force North Korea to the negotiating table. It is hoped that the two Koreas, once reaching nuclear parity, can start negotiations for nuclear arms reduction and disarmament. It is impossible, however, to judge the willingness of the North Korean regime to enter negotiations based on the fact that the South has acquired nuclear weaponry. Even if such negotiations would come to fruition, it is unlikely that all of the nuclear weapons would be disposed of, since a limited number of them would still be required to serve as a deterrent for either side. We can therefore ponder about at least two potential outcomes should South Korea pursue a nuclear weapon. The first one consisting of a phase of initial nuclear armament by either side, followed up with a second phase of controlled disarmament and maintenance of parity. The second outcome would boil down to a nuclear-powered, high-stakes arms race. The outcome of a potential nuclearization of South Korea is far from clear, with the stakes being never as high. The political implications of developing a nuclear weapon would not necessarily be in South Korea's favor. South Korea can exert international political pressure upon North Korea and its nuclear weapons program because it is an active member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Joint Declaration of the Korean Peninsula from 1992. If it would choose to develop a nuclear weapon, the ROK would lose the ethical and political foundation based upon which it exerts political pressure and would most likely jeopardize the support from the international community, especially the US. There is also the possibility of Russia, China, and North Korea responding with political and economic pressure which would further destabilize the Korean peninsula. There is the possibility of South Korea becoming a pariah in the international community should it set itself on the path of nuclear armament. Whatever deterrence it might gain, it also stands much to lose on the international scene. One can argue that the ROK has no need for a nuclear weapon considering its existing conventional capacities. The ROK has recently committed $81 billion towards strengthening its pre-existing defense capabilities and announced that it will spend an additional $262 billion in the next 5 years to bolster its conventional forces. Considering the funding of its armed forces and the number of active military personnel of at least 600,000, with another 2.7 million in reserve, the ROK conventional force represents a strong deterrent to its northern neighbor. However, can conventional forces alone be enough? One can argue that the mere possibility of a nuclear weapon and mutually assured destruction is a far more potent deterrent than any number of conventional weaponry. Some have argued that South Korea's nuclearization can benefit both South Korea and the US. The benefits for the South Koreans are obvious. South Korea could act and respond independently in the case of a nuclear strike from the north. The US, on the other hand, would not have to fear for the lives of its citizens as it would not be engaged in any potential nuclear exchange on the Korean peninsula. Despite these potential benefits, the South Korean administration still does not seriously consider the option of nuclearization because it is fearful of a negative reaction from the US, which could lead to possible sanctions. Some commentators therefore recommend the opening of closed-door talks via bilateral high-level meetings to discuss the potential benefits of South Korean nuclearization. In this scenario, the fate of the Korean peninsula lies potentially in the hands of an American diplomat who will draw or erase the red line for its ally South Korea. You might look at the Korean peninsula and think that its status quo is unbreakable. Bordered by regional and world powers, you might get the impression that the current ceasefire and peace is heavily monitored and enforced. However, the calculus can change very quickly. All it takes is one president or one shift in foreign diplomacy and the pieces will begin to fall. Imagine you are engaged in a game of chess against your neighbor and you are quite aware that in his pocket he carries a stick of dynamite. Based on your previous interactions with him throughout the years, you are aware of the fact that he is paranoid to a high degree and that he might resort to extreme measures if his defeat on the playing board becomes unavoidable. Should you trust your neighbor that he will not reach into his pocket? Or are you going to get a stick of dynamite for yourself? Not to use, of course, but to have in possession to show your neighbor that you can answer in kind, should the unimaginable come to fruition. Your decision will determine if your grandchildren inherit the chessboard you cherish so much, or a kingdom of ash and ruin. You have been listening to a Spearhead News Report. Thank you for your time and stay ahead of the curve.